has been to be a participant in the EU customs union. And yet, what we heard from a senior member of the Labour Party is that their real position is 100% Remain. Indeed, as one media report observed this week, during the cross-party talks, they even rejected a copy and paste, it was alleged, of their own proposal, which they described as unacceptable. There are some in government who have cautioned against listening to experts during this debate. But it is clear from the experts in business, the Bank of England Governor, of course everyone.
The Secretary of State and I were in the same room.
Midday here at Westminster. You're watching a BBC News special as MPs debate the government's Brexit deal. We'll be back with the Commons in just a moment, but we just want to let you know what has been happening on this historic day, potentially in Westminster. The opening of the debate today was at 9:30 this morning, and the Prime Minister laid out his case. But before he had the chance to speak, of course, the Speaker told the Commons which amendments to the government's motion he was going to bring. And he's bringing this Letwin amendment, the key Letwin proposal, which we will talk about in a few minutes, and a Peter Kyle amendment, which calls for a second referendum. We then heard Boris Johnson taking questions from the floor, a number of questions from all parties. It does seem as though the Prime Minister is getting some support. The ERG, the pro-Brexiteers, absolutely seem to be on board. It's not clear if all their members will back the government, but certainly it seems quite a majority of them will. Likewise, those Conservative MPs who were expelled over the Ban Act, again, some of them indicating support, although they are backing, some of them, the Letwin amendment. We have heard, though, from Alistair Burt within the last few minutes, a Conservative, saying that he will not back this Letwin amendment. So it's not totally clear what will happen on that. We've also heard from Dominic Grieve saying that the Prime Minister is trying to take us out on a gallop without proper scrutiny. But from Caroline Flint, the Labour pro-Brexit MP, saying that she thinks that the Ben Act was simply about trying to delay and stop Brexit altogether, and she wants to support the Prime Minister's deal, it seems. Well, opening today's debate, the Prime Minister told MPs that now was the time to get the deal done, and that any delay beyond October the 31st would be corrosive. Appealing to MPs to back the deal, he said this agreement could bring together a politically divided UK.
And now is the time for this great House of Commons to come together and bring the country together today. As I believe people at home are hoping and expecting, with a new way forward and a new and better deal both for Britain and for our friends in the EU. And that is the advantage of the agreement that we have struck with our friends in the last 2 days. Because this deal allows the UK, whole and entire, to leave the EU on October the 31st, in accordance with the referendum, while simultaneously looking forward to a new partnership based on the closest ties of friendship and cooperation. And I pay tribute to our European friends for escaping the prison of existing positions and showing the vision to be flexible by reopening the withdrawal agreement.
Well, in response to Mr Johnson, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said MPs could not vote for this deal, which was worse than the deal they had voted against already, Theresa May's deal, of course, 3 times.
He has renegotiated the withdrawal agreement and made it even worse. He's renegotiated the political declaration and made that even worse. We're having a debate today on a text for which there is no economic impact assessment and no accompanying legal advice. This government has sought to avoid scrutiny throughout the process and yesterday evening made empty promises on workers' rights and the environment. The same government that spent the last few weeks negotiating in secret to remove from the withdrawal agreement legally binding commitments on workers' rights and the environment. This government cannot be trusted, and these benches will not be duped.
Jeremy Corbyn there. Well, of course, today was billed as, in a way, a do-or-die moment, a moment for the House of Commons to decide whether or not to back Boris Johnson's deal. But it is now not clear whether that vote is going to happen, because the Commons Speaker, John Bercow, has chosen to put forward a very significant and controversial amendment to the deal. He's allowed that amendment to be put forward. It was proposed by Oliver Letwin and it will be voted on later by MPs. If it's passed, it will require the Prime Minister to write to the EU by the end of today to ask for a 3-month extension to Brexit. Let's have a closer look at that amendment, which has now been tabled by the former Conservative MP, Sir Oliver Letwin, who sits as an independent. Well, MPs will vote on whether to withhold parliamentary support for the Brexit deal unless and until legislation implementing the agreement in UK law is passed by MPs. Now, if this is passed, it will force the Prime Minister to seek a further delay to Brexit beyond the 31st of October deadline, and that is under the terms of the Benn Act, which was passed last month. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, is in the Houses of Parliament. Norman, it's very complex, but what is your assessment, first of all, as to whether we're going to get this crunch vote today?
Well, we seem to have moved from Super Saturday to so what next Saturday? And really, I don't think anyone knows. Interesting twist, though, in the last half an hour or so. You wonder whether the Letwin Amendment is actually going to get the numbers. Because we heard from Alistair Burt, who's been one of the Tory rebels, very critical of Boris Johnson, saying no, he couldn't back the Letwin Amendment. We've heard too from Caroline Flint, Labour MP, also attacking the Letwin Amendment and the Benn bill, so presumably she won't vote for it either. It opens up the possibility that if the Letwin Amendment doesn't get through, then Boris Johnson, it's game on for his big vote on his deal. And I suspect he will feel if he can see off the Letwin Amendment, maybe he can get his deal across the line. If he doesn't, then we're told he'll send MPs home. He'll simply pull the vote. There won't be a meaningful vote today. Everyone will come back on Tuesday, we're told, for another crack at this. What are we to make of it all? Well, I'm joined by Labour's John Healey. Now, Labour is going to back the Letwin Amendment. Why?
Because it puts beyond doubt the prevention that needs to be in place for Britain crashing out with no deal. And of course, it also allows Parliament to do its proper job on behalf of the public, which is to scrutinise the legislation that, if Boris Johnson does get a vote on his deal today, must come with it in order for Britain to Brexit.
If, however, it gets carried, Boris Johnson will have to ask or write a letter. But what certainty do you have that Europe will actually agree to it? Because we obviously heard from Jean-Claude Juncker, President Macron, Prime Minister Johnson saying there's no appetite in Europe for further delay.
Well, we're into the realm of speculation there, and the substance of today is really at the heart of the judgments everyone will take. And the judgments today are about the Boris Johnson deal, a bad deal, worse than Theresa May's deal, selling out British jobs and businesses and rights, and obviously starting the, if you like, the race to the bottom, where Boris Johnson wants to see Britain in the future competing by undercutting Europe on consumer standards, on environmental safety and on product safety as well.
What do you say to those MPs like Caroline Flint, who clearly feel that the package Boris Johnson came up with overnight is sufficient, and Boris Johnson's assurance in the Commons that the NHS will not be on the negotiating table, that there will be no lowering of standards? That clearly has convinced a number of Labour MPs.
Well, any promises in a press statement about not lowering standards are confounded completely by the changes he's made to the withdrawal agreement and political declaration. He may well say that the NHS will not be on the table in any trade negotiations with Trump, but the fact is the Tory legislation in place since 2012 opens up our NHS to competition and to further privatisations, which we've seen, and a trade deal with the US will put rocket boosters under that. No, I think to Caroline Flint, to Labour MPs, look at the hard substance of this deal. It's bad for British rights, it's bad for British jobs. In areas like ours, it will mean for steelmakers immediate tariffs and quotas for selling into our major markets in the European Union. So I think this is the substance that's at stake this afternoon. And you started by saying, look, there may or may not be a vote in the end. You know, Boris Johnson's said he wants to get Brexit done by the end of the month. He may not even get his job done and a vote today. And that's a combination of his closest allies, the DUP, don't like the deal. His closest colleagues, Philip Hammond, Oliver Letwin, don't trust him. And it's the people like that who know him best who trust him least.
But this is a huge parliamentary moment. If Labour MPs help Boris Johnson to get this over the line, what should happen to them?
Well, that'll be a matter for the Chief Whip. But at every stage in this, we've accepted that there are different views on Brexit in the Labour Party, just as there are in the country. And I'm confident that the large majority of Labour MPs, as we have in the past, will vote together. We'll take a hard look at Boris Johnson's deal and his weak explanation of it this afternoon, and we'll vote it down.
How will Labour vote on the confirmatory referendum amendment, which has also been put down? Will you back that?
I think we can be pretty clear that that won't come to a vote today. There's never been sufficient support in Parliament to see a second referendum, but on the technicality of the way the House of Commons works today, that's on a motion that the government certainly will not move.
But we know John McDonnell is addressing the massive People's Vote demonstration. Last time they were here, they were shouting, "Where's Jeremy Corbyn?" Now that the sort of second most powerful man, maybe the most powerful man in the Labour Party, is addressing the People's Vote, isn't it clear Labour is moving to become a pro-referendum party?
The People's Vote that we want, and that has always been our preference, is a general election. And once the real risk of Boris Johnson crashing Britain out with no deal at the end of October is removed, that clears the way for a general election, and people will then have the chance to pass judgment on 3 years of Tory Brexit chaos and 10 years of failure on every other front, from the NHS in all year round crisis to food banks to lower real wages, and of course what I lead for on Labour, the housing crisis that people face as well.
John Healey, thanks very much for your time. I think the honest answer is every which way you look, it is incredibly nip and tuck and tight, and the sort of early morning assumption that Oliver Letwin probably did have the numbers now looking a lot more doubtful.
OK, Norman, thanks very much indeed. We're going to go back live now to the House of Commons, because we've heard from the Prime Minister and from Jeremy Corbyn. Now the debate is being led by the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay and his shadow Keir Starmer, who's just got to his feet.
Mr. Speaker, my dad was a tool maker. He worked in a factory all his life in manufacturing, and we lived through those doldrums. We lived through those doldrums. And that's why when I go to a factory or plant now, I am proud for myself and my father when I see manufacturing on the just-in-time process, the revival that's gone on in parts of manufacturing. And go to any of those plants, those manufacturing plants, and management and unions speak with one voice. Don't take us out of the customs union. This deal does just that. I will in just a minute. And it will do huge damage to manufacturing. I will in just a minute. And what of services? Nothing in this deal is different from the deal of the previous Prime Minister. The weakest of weak deals for services. That's 80% of our economy. So it's clear what this deal does. It rips up our close trading relationship with the EU, and the price will be paid in damage to our economy and in job losses. And anyone doubting this should look at the words stripped out from the deal put forward by the previous Prime Minister. Put the text side by side and ask some difficult questions. Paragraph 19 used to read this: the parties envisage having a trading relationship on goods that is as close as possible with a view to facilitating the needs of legitimate trade. Those words, as close as possible, have been stripped out. Why? Now it's said we want as close as possible. Now it's said there are all sorts of assurances. But between the text as it was under the previous Prime Minister and the text before us today, the words that we want a trading relationship on goods that's as close as possible, those words have been taken out, and that's not an accident. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. At the heart of this is a question of destination, not an abstract of moving on today, but the impact of a deal on everyday life in towns like mine. So stop selling the sell-out deal to us as if this is the decision today. For all the talk of a deal of Norway plus, of Canada plus, the government presents us with Britain minus protections, minus opportunities, minus prospects. If you're confident in the deal, the government should put it to a final say. Now the deal is through the gate, and people that know more than we did have a say as to whether or not this is what they want. Does my honourable friend agree that a final say is the only way through this mess?
I do agree, but I really want to press this point because, as I say, this isn't just about getting a deal over the line. That's not the end of it. It's what we're getting over the line and what it means for our country. And I invite the Secretary of State to intervene on me. Why were the words "as close as possible" taken out of the text? If the aspiration of the government is to be as close as possible, why take the words out? Nothing. Let's try. I'll give way in just a moment. Again, going through that exercise of laying the two texts aside alongside each other, the words about alignment are all but gone. A deliberate decision has been taken to take out the aspiration of as close as possible trading relationship, and a deliberate decision has been taken to take out all the words about alignment. That is not an accident. That is not a typo. That is a deeply political decision that tells you everything about the direction of travel under this deal. I give way.
My right honourable learned friend for giving way. And doesn't that go precisely to the heart of why those of us on this side will not be able to vote for this deal? Because we are hearing from our colleagues in the trade union movement who represent millions of workers, including those who work in manufacturing, and they are saying that this deal will be damaging for the future of jobs and livelihoods. And how can we trust the Tories on workers' rights when through the whole time that I was a trade union officer and the time that I have been a member of Parliament, this government have reduced working people's rights?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'll make one more point and then I will give way. I'll just make one more point and then I'll give way, if you don't mind, because I just want to reinforce this and then I'll pause. Because not only is the aspiration for as close as possible taken out, references to alignment taken out, the new text, of course, removes the backstop as the basis of the future relationship. So not the backstop in its own right, but as the basis for the future relationship. And that's very important, because it means that the starting point for the next stage is a baseline FTA with no safety net for workplace rights, consumer rights and environmental standards. They've gone from the binding legal withdrawal agreement altogether. They're found, and I'll come back to them, in the political declaration. So they're out of the binding and into the political direction. I said I'd give way. No, I'll give way.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Whilst we listen to his confession entitled "Why I Wish I Voted for the Previous Deal," could he just share with the House what in actual fact his honest assessment is? That unless a deal said we will remain within the European Union and there will be no changes, he will find false tests and artificially high hurdles in order to preclude him voting for anything, which does not mean we ignore the referendum result.
That's just nonsense. Let me just answer it directly. I have stood at this dispatch box and pressed amendments on the customs union time and time and time again. And members on that side have voted against it. We have put forward a basis of a deal, and we voted for it on this side of the House. So that intervention is just nonsense. So, I will, in just a minute, I will make some progress and then I will give way on both sides. It's obvious where this ends. It either ends with an FTA which significantly weakens rights, standards and protections, or it ends in no deal and WTO terms at the end of the transition. I said I'll give way here, and I will give way across.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for focusing attention on manufacturing. Does he believe, is his assessment, that this deal would lead to new rules of origin checks and other red tape on UK manufacturers exporting to the EU?
Yes, and anybody who's read the text knows it, because it's absolutely clear there will have to be those checks. And let me make one broader point that was made to me by manufacturers themselves. So this is not me speaking, it's what they have said to me. I won't name the company, one of our major motor manufacturers said to me, we don't think we would ever be able to take advantage of any new trade agreement because we could never prove that 50% of our components come from the UK. And that's one of the rules. And that was their concern to me. They didn't. I'll make this point because it's a really powerful point. And if people have not grasped this, then they don't know what they're voting for. They said to me, our components come from across the EU, and at the moment, we can show that 50% of them satisfy the rule to take advantage of the trade agreements that the EU has struck. Their position is they could never satisfy that requirement if the area is shrunk to the UK, and therefore their point to me was not that they're against new trade agreements. Businesses aren't. But they said they will not be able to take advantage of them. That's what they said to me. I said I'd give way, and I will.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. The thing that puzzles me is I hear him setting out strong objections to the strategy this government has pursued. And yet, had the Labour Party agreed to hold a general election when it was first mooted, that election would be over by now, and if they'd persuaded the country, there would currently be a Labour Prime Minister at the dispatch box. So what is it about the Labour Party's position that they're not willing to put it to the country?
I think I said this in the debate last week, but I'll say it again. I'm not going to vote for a general election until I know no deal is off the table and we've got an extension. It's as simple as that. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. I have really agonised this week over whether to support this deal, and it's been profoundly difficult.
Steady on.
But does he share my concern with regard to Northern Ireland, that by disturbing the careful balance within the Good Friday Agreement between the two communities, we run the risk of inflaming unionist opinion in potentially a very dangerous way, just in a sense, as the honourable member for Strangford made clear in his intervention?
I am concerned about the position in Northern Ireland, and the Secretary of State quoted me on this earlier. It's true that I and the Labour Party had reservations about the backstop. I'm not sure there are many people who didn't have reservations about the backstop. But on analysis, we thought it was right for Northern Ireland, and therefore we focused our attention on the political declaration. I criticised it. I said what I thought was wrong with it. I was critical, for example, of the fact that it didn't hardwire dynamic alignment of workplace rights. But ultimately, we thought that upholding the Good Friday Agreement was more important and more significant. And I will also say this, because, again, it's very important to read the small print. Whilst it is true that the current deal says that Northern Ireland remains, as it were, in the UK's customs territory, it goes on to explain that for goods going into Northern Ireland, the only ones that escape going effectively into the EU's customs unions are those that are at no risk of going beyond Northern Ireland and are not going into manufacturing. And so the volume of goods that cross the border that truly are treated as if Northern Ireland is in the customs union is only that small category, and the burden is on the person who's exporting to prove that. And you explain to me, I'm sorry, Secretary of State or anybody explain to me how that operates without very careful and extensive checks. Now, I'm going to make some progress and then I will give way again. I will give way because I promised before.
I thank the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech, and he's making a very good point about the backstop, because it was indeed a backstop. It was there in the last event, as it were. Would he agree with me that this is a new agreement, and especially in relation to Northern Ireland? This isn't a backstop. This is their future. It's essentially in perpetuity. And the careful analysis which he's now providing to the House, and you can see honourable and right honourable members understanding and listening, is the danger of us, frankly, being bounced into a decision today with terrible consequences for our union and our country.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I agree, and it's a point I'll develop in one moment. I will take one further intervention first.
Thanks. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. The former Prime Minister used to say that no deal is better than a bad deal. Does he share my concern that the current Prime Minister just lets slip that this deal heroically manages to be both? In other words, it's both a bad deal, but with a backdoor to a no deal if there's no transition agreed, if there's no extension to that transition agreed at the end of next year.
I do agree with that, and it's a point I will develop. And in recognition to the previous Prime Minister, although she said that, I always felt that she had a profound sense of public duty and properly recognised the real risks of no deal and ultimately would not have taken us there. I do not have that level of trust in the current Prime Minister. I will give way. I'll give way twice.
My right honourable learned friend for giving way. Could you just explore further this issue of customs checks? If a lorry leaves Dumfries for Northern Ireland or leaves North Wales for Northern Ireland and its ultimate destination is the Republic of Ireland, where and when will those customs checks take place?
See, there have to be checks. There have to be checks, and they have to be done at the border between England, Scotland and Wales or Northern Ireland. And there's no getting away from that. This argument the Prime Minister earlier tried to deploy, that he's not putting a border in the Irish Sea, is just wrong. It is absolutely wrong. Any goods that don't fall within that restricted category of being proven that they're not going any further than Northern Ireland and that they're not going into manufacturing are going to be subject to checks, because that is the test written into the deal. I'll give way once more, and then I'm going to make some progress.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. Ultimately, the bottom line is, what is the future of people's livelihoods? Never mind what your emotional passions are about being in the European Union or not. What are the implications for workers and their jobs? Ford left Bridgend, 1,700 jobs, 12,000 jobs across the South Wales economy, because they were worried about a no-deal Brexit. I have looked at this bill, and there is a real risk that this is the end of just-in-time manufacturing in the whole of the UK. Does my right honourable friend agree?
I do agree, and I am deeply concerned, because, as I say, I am proud of the manufacturing base that we have got and the revival it's gone through. I'm going to make some progress. I've taken a lot of I will take some more later on. I'm going to make some progress. Mr. Speaker, because it's very important that we work through not just the technicalities, but also where this leads us politically, because this is about the direction of travel for our country. If we go to a bare FTA, and that's what it would mean, the government's own estimates show that that's a loss of about 6.7% growth in GDP over 15 years. And every region and nation will be poorer for it. The Prime Minister's letter to President Tusk of the 19th of August made it clear that from the government's point of view, from his point of view, the point of our exit is to allow the UK to diverge from the rights and standards of the EU. And let's nail this one. You don't need that if you want to go up and have better standards. You don't have to break the rule to bring in better standards. You can do that under the existing rule. So anybody who wants to change the rule is not doing it to have the freedom to bring in better standards, because you don't need to change the rule for that. The only reason you need to diverge is if you want to go down. I will take some interventions. I will finish this point, and then I will take intervention. I will in a moment. I'm just going to finish this point of it, and that's why, on this question of divergence, it's very important to focus on the level playing field protections, because, as I say, they're out of what was legally binding into the political declaration and only apply in full until the end of the transition period, 2020. And it's obvious where the government is going. They want a licence to deregulate and to diverge. And I know they will disavow that. And I know they want the deal through. And they will say never. Of course not. But it's obvious where it leads, because once you've diverged, once you've moved out of alignment with the EU, trade becomes more difficult. I will just finish the point. Trade becomes more difficult, and the EU is not seen any longer as our priority in trade, and the gaze goes elsewhere to make up. I'll finish this point, if I may. I will finish this point, because once you've moved out of alignment, you don't move back. And the further you move out, the less easy it is to trade with the EU 27. And once you've done that, you've broken the economic model we've been operating for decades. And once you've done that, you look elsewhere. And once you've done that, you look across to the United States. I will finish this point, and then I'll give way. The gaze goes across to the US, and that's a different economic model. It's not just another country, it's a different economic model, a deregulated model. In the US, 10 days is the holiday entitlement. Many, many contracts at work are called contracts at will. Hugely powerful corporate bodies have far more power than the workforce. So this is a political direction of travel, not a technical decision on the EU that takes us to a different economic model, one of deregulation, one of low standards, one where the balance between the workforce and corporate bodies gets far worse than it is now. I'll give way.
My honourable friend for giving way, would he agree that what this is a project, an ideology for the right and by the hard right? That's what we're looking at. That's right. And this does not get Brexit done. What we should be doing now is looking forward for the future of our children. Isn't it right that only by putting this back to the people and listening to all those people, the hundreds and thousands who are marching out there today, listening to those young people and giving them a say on their future?
I agree with the tenor of what was said. I will give way.
He talks about workers' rights. The EU entitlement for holiday pay is 4 weeks. In the UK, it's 5.6 weeks. If we wanted to reduce that entitlement and to reduce standards, why would we have done that already?
Well, because Parliament. Because that is something that the Labour Party opposite parties would never countenance, and I don't think the government would countenance. The point is a very...
Order! Mr Hughes, you are a most eccentric denizen of the House. The Shadow Secretary of State for Brexit is not conducting a private conversation with you. Calm yourself. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you. I'll give way.
To my right honourable friend, because the Conservative Party has luxuriated in telling us that the Ben Act undermined our negotiations by forcing them into no deal, just preventing no deal from being on the table if we left on the 31st of October. But the Prime Minister, in his own words, has said he's negotiated a great deal with that restriction in place. So what possible argument can they have for not agreeing that we cannot leave at the end of the next phase of negotiations with no deal at the end of 2020? Why would they not accept that restriction, given that they negotiated what the Prime Minister calls a great deal?
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I've never accepted the proposition that by ensuring the country against no deal, that undermines the negotiations. And I remind the House that in the negotiating window that ended on the 29th of March, at no point in that 2 years did this House take no deal off the table. Therefore, the entire negotiations were carried out with the risk of no deal. The previous Prime Minister brought back a deal, and half her own side wouldn't vote for it. I will give way.
I'm obviously very grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and he's been very generous with his interventions. But can I just take him back to the very philosophical and logical argument that he is now trying to make? It seems to me that from the dispatch box on that side, the argument is that they have to have the European Union to protect them on workers' rights because there is almost likely to be a permanent Conservative government that will threaten those workers' rights. Where does that exist, that the Labour Party doesn't have the courage to say they would fight an election and they would make the case for stronger workers' rights and win that election, in which case that's democracy in action rather than somebody else protecting it?
Well, of course we would. But the point is this. The point is this, and it is not being answered by any of these interventions. Since the current rule allows you to have higher standards, why do you write into the deal you want to diverge?
My honourable friend for giving way. When we were in government, the Labour government did legislate to go beyond European minima many times, including granting 6 million workers an extra 8 days paid leave. The point is, much of the time we were doing that, it was being vociferously opposed, and particularly by the Prime Minister, who built his journalistic career on attacking these kinds of measures. The point he is making is correct, is that this is not just about the legislation that we pass here. It is about the common rule book that gives us market access across the European Union. And the Prime Minister cannot promise a deregulatory future to the ERG and a regulatory future to the Labour Party.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, which very carefully and ably makes the point. I'm going to make some progress. I have given away many, many times, because I'm just going to make some progress, then I will give way again. I have given way a number of times. So, of the two possible outcomes, one is this deregulated free trade agreement, which in the end, whatever people say, will drive us away from the European economic model towards a different economic model. And we will look back on this, as a turning point in our history of much greater significance than whether this deal technically gets over the line tonight. But the other possible outcome is this, and I do want to address it, and it's been put to me in interventions. It's that there's no deal at the end of the transition period. And this has to be significantly addressed, because I know some colleagues are tempted to vote for the deal because they believe it prevents or removes the possibility of crashing out on WTO terms. It does not. Under the previous deal, if the future relationship was not ready by the end of transition, the backstop kicked in. That prevented WTO terms. That's gone. This is a trapdoor to no deal. And I will quote the honourable member for Basildon and Billericay, and I hope I get it accurately, and if I don't, he'll correct me. But as I understood what he said, and I've got it in quotes, the reason I'm inclined to vote for this deal is very simple. If trade talks are not successful, then we could leave on no deal terms. And that's stark. It's stark. Oh, I will. Yes, I said I would.
He is right with the quote, but what he has done has been very selective and taken it out of context. But because had he continued, I then made the point that it is commercial reality that by leaving no deal on the table in any negotiations, it actually makes more likely a good and fair trade deal. And that is something I and the vast majority of colleagues in this place actually want. We want an FTA agreed with the EU by December 2020, and my firm belief is, and I'm not alone here, is that by actually scrapping the backstop, the previous one, we stand more chance of achieving it.
The honourable gentleman to put his full quote in the library for the delectation of colleagues. Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, I am genuinely grateful, and that's why I wanted to take the intervention. But the fact remains that he's right when he says if the trade deals are not successful, then we could leave on no-deal terms. And let's just explore, Mr. Speaker, before we rush into the lobbies, what that actually means. Because the decision on extending transition under this deal needs to be taken by the end of July next year. That's 8 months away. It's very hard to see how any government could negotiate a completed future relationship within such a short time frame, and particularly one which wants to diverge. The Prime Minister brushed this away earlier by saying, well, we're aligned. Well, that's true. And if you wanted to stay aligned, you could probably do a trade deal a lot more quickly. But this Prime Minister and this government wants to diverge. And so the idea that this does not lead to a no-deal Brexit is wrong, and nobody should vote for this deal on the basis that it is the way to ensure that we don't leave at the end of 2020 on WTO terms. I'm going to make a little bit more progress, then I will give way. Now, today, the Prime Minister dangles prospects of workers' rights and indicates amendments he might be inclined to take down the line. Promises, promises. And I know these are really important issues for men. I will make this point and then I'll give way. I know how important these issues are to many members on this side, particularly the question of workplace rights, environmental rights and consumer standards. I remind all members of this House that not a single trade union supports this deal. And I urge everyone in the House to reflect on the likelihood of this Prime Minister keeping his promises. This has been made, this is a point that's been made, but I'm going to make it again. Last November, the now Prime Minister told the DUP conference in terms regulatory checks and even customs controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland would be damaging to the fabric of the Union, and he went on to say no British Conservative government could or should sign up to any such arrangement. His words. What does this deal do? It puts checks and controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It creates a customs border in the Irish Sea. It does precisely what the Prime Minister told the DUP last November he would not do. Typical of this Prime Minister. So those that are considering today putting their trust in this Prime Minister need to reflect on how he's treated his supply and confidence partners. Promise, then burn. And I ask how anybody could trust any promise he is now making. I do give way.
My honourable friend for giving way. This deal not only rules out the customs union, it also rules out a single market relationship, which affects service sector jobs alongside the manufacturing jobs. And as he said, it is a bonfire. It's going to be a bonfire on labour standards and environmental standards. Does he agree with me that this is a Trojan horse for no-deal Brexit? And that is why, on this side of the House, our colleagues must vote it down, and others who believe in the national interest must vote it down.
Yes. I agree completely. I said I'd give way here, and I will, and then I'll give way behind me. Yeah.
grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He will have heard the Prime Minister make a commitment to me and to this House that he would legislate, if necessary, to ensure that workers' rights in this country could not be inferior from those in the European Union. So to his question of trust and confidence, if such legislation were pursued in parallel with the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, or in the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, so that the two could be decided together, surely that would give the Right Honourable Gentleman the confidence that he requires.
I'm grateful for that intervention. And the point is this. For a Prime Minister who said no British Conservative government could or should sign up to any such arrangement to now go and sign up to it, it's exactly why we shouldn't trust it. It's why we should support Amendment A. It's a very important intervention, and I take it seriously. That is why Amendment A is so important, because that gives this House the opportunity to know what precisely the commitment is and what words are going to go into the legislation. What I'm not prepared to do, I'm afraid, and what I think the vast majority on this side of the House are not prepared to do, is take the Prime Minister's word. There is more than enough evidence that his word doesn't mean anything and cannot be trusted. I said I'd give way here. Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I was one of those that worked in industry in Coventry during the period of the Thatcher government, and as my honourable friend will know, like his father, we've seen thousands of jobs every week lost in the motor car industry. Now, big companies like Jaguar Land Rover and company are very, very worried about the future of the industry, bearing in mind about certain things to prove, and if they don't prove it, they'll have to pay tariffs on that, and that can affect jobs and so forth. Now, the last point I'd want to make is, if anybody knows why we're suspicious about any government in relation to trade union rights, you've only got to look at this government under the previous Prime Minister's trade union bill, and you'll see what exactly they've got in mind.
Well, I am grateful for that intervention. It just reinforces the point that manufacturing, having been on its knees, and now having revived, at least in part in the way it has, why anybody, whichever way they voted, would want to take an axe to it, I will never understand. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress, then I'll give way again. I've mentioned, I'm just going to make some, I've given way so much, I will give way again. I do just need to make some progress so that others can get in. I want to turn briefly to Amendment A in the name of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. And I want to thank him and his colleagues across the House for the cross-party work they've done in recent months, and this amendment is in that spirit. It's genuinely cross-party. It makes clear that this House will not be bounced into supporting what is a very bad deal without a proper chance to scrutinise it. It would allow the House to make sure the legal text is acceptable, and to provide time to seek changes through the passage of the implementing legislation. And it would ensure that the Benn Act can be applied. And can I say this? It doesn't cause delay, because that exercise is going to have to be gone through anyway. So it's not to vote to delay, it's a vote to get on with looking at the next stage, a stage which is going to have to look at. What it does provide is an insurance policy against signing up to a deal that isn't what it seems, with the risk of a no-deal Brexit to boot. Mr. Speaker, the deal before this House is a thoroughly bad deal, a bad deal for jobs, rights and living standards, a bad deal for the future direction of the country. It will put us on a path to an entirely different economy and society, one of deregulation and divergence. It will end either in a bare-bones free trade agreement or no deal in 8 months. It stands against everything the labour and trade movement stands for.
Order, we don't need people in a rather juvenile fashion calling out behind you. The Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman will give way if and when he wants to give way, as was true of the Secretary of State, and notwithstanding the notably generous-spirited instincts of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Surrey Heath, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I'm not aware that the Shadow Brexit Secretary has asked the Right Honourable Gentleman to be his mentor. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, If we pass this deal today, it will be a long way back for the communities we represent, and I urge all members to reject it.
Thank you. To move Amendment A, I call the Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for West Dorset, Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to move the amendment which is in my name and that of many other honourable and right honourable members. I don't need to detain the House for long. The purpose of the amendment, as has been said in several interventions and speeches, is to keep in place the insurance policy provided by the Benn Act, which prevents us from crashing out automatically if there is no deal in place by the 31st of October. When the Prime Minister brings his implementing legislation to this House next week, I will vote for it. But we all know that the votes on that legislation throughout its passage will be tight. The Prime Minister has a strategy. I fully accept that, and I accept that it is rational in its own terms. It is that he wants to be able to say to any waverers, it's my deal or no deal, vote for the implementing legislation, or we crash out. Now, I understand that strategy, but we can't be sure that such a threat from the Prime Minister would work. And I won't, if you'll forgive me, because I'm going to be so brief that I won't take any interventions. We can't be sure that such a threat from the Prime Minister would work. And I, despite my support for the Prime Minister's deal, do not believe that it's responsible to put the nation at risk by making that threat. So I'm moving this amendment, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that whichever way any future votes may go, today or next week or the week after, we can be secure in the knowledge that the UK will have requested an extension tonight, which, if granted, can be used if and to the extent necessary, and only the extent necessary, to prevent a no-deal exit.
The question is that Amendment A be made, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for moving his amendment. We come now to Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a considerable pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. Let me commend him for his amendment and for his contribution this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, an equal partner within the Union, a nation within the European Union. The broken promises of 2014 from this government and the Better Together campaign could not be more stark than they are today. Scotland has been totally and utterly shafted by this Prime Minister and this Tory government. Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom where our democratic rights are not being respected. England voted leave, Wales voted leave, and Northern Ireland gets to remain in the EU single market and customs union, a special arrangement to protect its interest in people. But Scotland has been ignored. Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against its will. Mr. Speaker, 62% of Scotland voted to remain. Yet this Tory government and this Brexit fanatic Prime Minister has ignored Scotland's wishes and the interest by bringing forward a deal that will weaken our economy. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party categorically reject this appalling Brexit deal, and we will vote it down today. Not only would this deal be devastating for Scotland, dragging us out of the European Union, the single market and the customs union against our will, it is clear that a right-wing Brexiteer have been assured by senior Tory government ministers that backing this deal could lead to a no-deal crash-out if trade talks fail next year. Mr. Speaker, anyone tempted to vote for this deal today needs to be warned that this is a blank cheque to the Vote Leave campaign, who are now running the Tory government to crash all of us out of the European Union on a no-deal basis at the end of transition next year. The Prime Minister's deal isn't a deal at all. It's the gateway to a no-deal Brexit, taking us off the cliff edge not at the end of October, but at the end of 2020. Let me be clear. Any Brexit would have disastrous implications for Scotland's economy.
They don't care.
Mr. I'll be here.
Would you agree with me that whilst agreeing with the member for Dorset's amendment and his idea that we'll stop no deal, what we have in front of us is no guarantee from the Prime Minister that he will avoid crashing out after the transition period, in the knowledge that any deals that we know of take longer than a year to put together. So isn't this really a death row deal? We've got a year and we'll be crashing out, and it's our duty to vote against it.
I'm most grateful because the Prime Minister was given the opportunity to rule that out. The Secretary of State was given the opportunity to rule that out, and neither did. And I would say to colleagues right across this House, take note of that. Take note, anyone that's tempted to vote for this deal today, because there is a very real risk that a no-deal Brexit takes place by the back door. Mr. Speaker, I will make some progress. I know that many colleagues wish to speak. The viability of our economic future would be brought into question because of the damage it would do to investment, to population growth and our key exports. All Brexit assessments show that the United Kingdom and that Scotland will be poorer no matter how we leave the European Union.
Correct.
And if those on government benches disagree, why have they not done an economic impact assessment on their deal? How are members of Parliament supposed to debate and decide on the details of this deal when the government hasn't provided a detailed analysis? It absolutely beggars belief that something so fundamental to all our citizens' futures, and yet there is no economic impact assessment.
Thank the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, for giving way, and he does appreciate that we come from this from very different perspectives. However, today I do believe we should be united on this issue. This is not a good deal for Northern Ireland. I would plead with him not to try and suggest that what would be a bad deal for Northern Ireland should then be a good deal for the people of Scotland. If what was being applied today to the people of Scotland, I would be voting against it for his sake and for his people's sake, and that's why I'm encouraging him to vote against it for our sake.
Well, we will certainly vote against it because I don't believe this is a good deal, period. But, Mr. Speaker, how did the Prime Minister even signal up to a deal without understanding the impact on the economy? What a dereliction of duty. Mr. Speaker, the truth is, because the Prime Minister isn't concerned with the economy, the Prime Minister isn't concerned with the facts. The Brexiteers don't care about facts during the referendum campaign, and it looks as if they're doing the same now. The truth must hurt, because, Mr. Speaker, the truth is this. Every version of Brexit is going to leave us worse.
Correct.
It would continue to damage our relationship with the European Union, but doesn't grant us much scope to develop relations with other countries. It is also clear that the heightened economic uncertainty has been forecast to reduce business investment by £1 billion in 2019, damaging our economy and leaving Scotland poorer.
Much better off.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I'm mindful of words. What a fool I was, only a puppet. And so was Ulster, and so was Ireland in the political game that was to get the Conservative Party into power. Now, while the DUP may be choking in the words of Carson, I am sure that he, as a member and the leader of our political party, will remind the government that Scotland will not be duped a second time.
My honourable friend is correct. And you know what I say to the Conservatives and those that are here for now from Scotland, that if this deal goes through, if this has the impact on Scotland and creates a competitive disadvantage, then it's increasingly clear, and we can see it from the messages that are coming from us, even today, from people that voted no in our referendum in 2014. They are making it very clear that they want Scotland's right to choose. And I make this guarantee to you, Mr. Speaker, that Scotland will become an independent nation, and an independent nation in short order.
People to him for giving way. I think the House is faced with an impossible choice. This is like being asked to buy a house just based on the estate agent details designed to sell it, with no chance to look inside it or see any kind of contract on it. We spend about 2 months scrutinising and debating the finance bill, and that is just for a one-year budget for Britain. Isn't it absolutely ridiculous that we can't even see the bill, let alone the economic impact, before we're allowed to take a decision?
Absolutely, and heaven knows what the term of the mortgage might be. Let me make it clear, I certainly wouldn't be buying any house from this Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Brexit in any form will damage the branding, reputation and standing of Scottish produce. Our civil society, its regulatory alignment to key markets, its commercial and political relationships abroad, and even recognition of skills and qualifications. Scotland relies on the skills and labour that the EU offers for its economic growth. Brexit will only serve to weaken our access to a vital labour market, and considering that Scotland's native population is declining, we need more migration to our country, not less.
To the right honourable gentleman for finally giving way, but what he is not telling the House is that every major business group in Scotland is encouraging this House to support this deal today. The Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, the NFUS, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, all of them pleading with us to bring uncertainty to an end and to vote for this deal. Don't listen to the SNP. They are not Scotland.
We're grateful to the honourable gentleman member for Stirling. I remind the House that interventions must be brief and we need to expedite progress. Subtle hint. Mr Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it is illuminating to hear such voices in this House, because I'm afraid the harsh reality is that many business organisations, many industry organisations in Scotland see the impact, and not just in Scotland, throughout the UK. The British Chamber of Commerce, the National Farmers Union, the Food and Beverage Association, the Timber Trade Federation have all talked about the negative impact of this deal, but you never get the truth from the Scottish Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, no, I'm going to make progress because I'm aware that other colleagues wish to speak.
Well done, Ian.
Mr. Speaker, it didn't have to be like this. If the Prime Minister had any interest in the people of Scotland, he would have engaged with our Scottish Government. From the very beginning, the Scottish Government sought to compromise. We did this by offering up Scotland's place in Europe, a compromise position for all of the United Kingdom and for Scotland to remain in the single market and the customs union. And, you know, I have to tell you that we had no engagement with the UK Government over these papers. But I can say this to you, when I went to see Michel Barnier, he'd read every page of that document. That's the difference between the attitude of our friends and colleagues in Europe and the disdain that our Scottish Government gets from Westminster. Our plan was dismissed out of hand and then followed by years of the UK Government ignoring Scotland, ignoring our Parliament. Mr. Speaker, with Northern Ireland getting access to the single market and the customs union, it is clear that the Prime Minister is willing to put trust in the people of Northern Ireland to manage its relationship. So it's inexplicable that he won't trust the people of Scotland, who also voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union.
Absolutely.
This offer gives Northern Ireland a competitive advantage over Scotland. And whilst we respect and understand the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, I want to be clear. Everyone in the SNP wants to see the continuation of peace and stability. But the proposal in this deal is, in effect, is being kept in the single market and the customs union as a consequence. That was our compromise position, and the UK government completely ignored us, ignored Scotland. The Prime Minister has shown the people of Scotland total contempt. A Prime Minister who has no mandate from Scotland, yet he seeks to impose his Brexit against our democratically expressed will, silences the wishes of our people and weakening our economy. This Prime Minister and his Brexit fan club in number 10 don't care about Scotland. They're obsessed with only one thing: winning and delivering their Brexit fantasy at any cost. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and lies of the... Well, you know, I hear the ministers shouting from the front bench. Not true. Where was the engagement with the Scottish Government of our place in Europe? It simply didn't happen. It was absolutely, completely true. He can shake his head because he doesn't like the reality. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and the lies of Vote Leave brought the country to vote for Brexit in the first place. And this should be something...
Order, resume your seat. As far as I'm aware, the right honourable gentleman is not currently giving way. And so the order! And so the Chancellor that he shouldn't stand there portentously as though he has an absolute right to intervene. It might be courteous to allow him to do so, but such an allowance has not yet been made. Mr. Ian Blackford.
I'm afraid today, Mr. Speaker, this House will be listening to our voices, and perhaps the right honourable gentleman might catch your eye later on. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and lies of Vote Leave brought this country to vote for Brexit in the first place, and this would be something that the Prime Minister and many in his cabinet should be ashamed of. They have torn their country, their parliament, their own party apart. Mr. Speaker, this is the beginning of the end of their precious union and their distorted Etonian vision for society. Scotland will not be ignored anymore. The deal must be stopped and binned today. Whether this deal passes today or not, the government needs an extension. This deal is devastating for Scotland. We will not vote for it, and we call for the extension period to be used for an election, so that we can get rid of this rotten Tory government out of Downing Street. The Scottish National Party are here to do our job, to stand stronger for Scotland. Those across this House who ever want to lay claim to representing the voices and the interests of the people of Scotland, you cannot support this deal. You cannot inflict economic and social harm on our society. Myth after myth from the Prime Minister and his cronies, but the facts are clear. The European Union accounts for 56% of the UK's exports and 65% of imports, either through the EU directly or through other countries where the EU has trade arrangements with. The direct value of EU trade is over triple the value of US trade. The Brexit Secretary even said that the EU was the UK's most important partner. 100,000 jobs in Scotland at risk. Our fishermen, farmer and crofters, all disadvantaged by this deal. As the Scottish Seafood Association put it, this could switch the lights out for a small exporter. 5 separate certificates all have to be done on October 31st. For a small exporter, that is possibly trying to sell 30 kilos of top quality langoustines to a restaurant in Paris. Switch the lights off. The restaurant owner is going to go and buy his lovely langoustines somewhere else. Not my words, that's from the Scottish Seafood Association. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that people in Scotland can see the government front bench are laughing. People's livelihoods are at risk, and the government front bench thinks it's funny. You should be utterly, utterly ashamed of yourselves. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party will not stand by and let this government rip our economy and our country's future apart. We are Europeans, and Scotland is a European nation. Members across this House should unite with the SNP and bring this government down. A general election is the best way now to stop this Prime Minister and stop this dangerous Brexit. Mr. Speaker, let me say this. Anyone, any single member here this afternoon who backs the Tory Prime Minister and his cheating Vote Leave campaign by shafting Scotland will never, not ever be forgiven by the people of Scotland.
Found in the courts.
Overnight, we've seen the reports, the rumours and the whispers. Mr. Speaker, is the Labour Party really going to allow their members of Parliament to vote for this catastrophic Brexit deal? Let me remind the Labour Party what the TUC said. This deal would be a disaster for working people. It would hammer the economy, cost jobs and sell workers' rights down the river. The Prime Minister has negotiated even a worse deal than Theresa May. All MPs should vote against it. That's the words of the TUC. So let me ask, why has the Leader of the Opposition not yet guaranteed that all Labour MPs will vote with the Scottish National Party this afternoon against this deal? A deal that would be devastating for Scotland, ripping us out of the EU against our will, terminating our freedom of movement rights, threatening jobs, living standards, our public services and the economy. Is the Leader of the Labour Party really willing to allow any members of his party to write a blank cheque for this Tory Prime Minister to deliver Brexit? Not a single member of the Labour Party should be voting for a deal that delivers a race to the bottom on workers' rights, on environmental standards, and paves the way for dismantling our precious NHS. It would be absolutely staggering that with a no-deal threat on the table, any Labour MP could even think about voting for this toxic deal. Mr. Speaker, Labour must not be the handmaidens of a Tory Brexit, which we know will cost thousands of jobs and harm people's livelihoods. So I appeal to every member of...
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. I wondered if he got section of his speech from John Lansman. So could I ask the right honourable gentleman, does he agree with me that when it comes to workers' rights, the EU isn't God? The fact is, local authorities up and down the UK have to outsource contracts to the European Union at the detriment of workers in their local communities. We have seen a rise in zero-hour contracts and poor conditions, partly because of that outsourcing. Does he agree with me?
I thank the right honourable lady. We were colleagues together in committee. I'm fond of her, as she knows.
To the right honourable gentleman to face the House so we can all hear. Mr Ian Blackford.
I simply say to my right honourable friend that I would trust the European Union with workers' rights before I would trust... The opposition must stop the excuses and finally act by backing the SNP tonight to reject this damaging deal, secure an extension and call an election so we can bring this Tory government down and stop Brexit. But Mr. Speaker, meanwhile, Scottish Tory MPs are prepared to vote for a deal that they previously pledged that they would not back. Simple irresponsibility and moral cowardice. I say to the Scottish Tories, you are serving the death knell on the Union by voting for this deal. Independence is coming, and we will take our place as a proud European nation. What a shift in time, Mr. Speaker, from what Ruth Davidson said in 2014. No means we stay in. We are members of the European Union.
In the UK on BBC Two, coverage continues on BBC One and the BBC News Channel.
More than ever, you can never, not ever trust a